This is the Retroid Pocket 5, and this is the Anbernic RG556. And today we're going to find out if it's worth the upgrade if you already own a 556, or which one you should buy if you're buying one for the first time. Let's take a look. As far as the specs goes, the Retroid Pocket 5 has the Snapdragon 865 processor versus the Anbernic RG556 has the Unisoc T820, which is a less powerful chip, but we'll find out just how much of a difference that makes in today's video. They both have 8GB of LPDDR4X RAM, 128GB of storage, and they both have 5.5-inch 1080p OLED screens, but we will see if there's any differences between those two as well. The Retroid Pocket 5 has a 5000 mAh battery versus 5500 in the Anbernic, and the Retroid has Wi-Fi 6 versus only Wi-Fi 5 in the RG556. A quick note on that, many users have had issues with the Wi-Fi strength in the RG556, finding that it is pretty poor if you are far from the access point. So if you're considering using this for online gaming or game streaming, that may already be a deal breaker for the 556, but we'll talk about such things more as we go here. As far as the pricing goes, right now it is $219 plus $15 shipping for the Retroid Pocket 5. And the Anbernic RG556 at the time of this video is on sale for $167 plus $15 shipping, but normally it is listed at $185. Although since it's been out for longer, you will probably find more sales and discounts on this one. That puts us at anywhere from a $34 to $52 difference in price, the Retroid Pocket 5 being a little bit more expensive. So let's see if that is worth the money. Physically speaking, you can see that there is a notable size difference between the two. Because the RG556 has these ergonomic grips on it, it is significantly wider. It's a little bit thicker, mostly just due to the grips. And let's take a look at what those grips look like here. As you can see, they both have a bit of that pronounced grippy shape, although the 556 is much taller, so it has a little bit more, or rather quite a bit more to grip on to there. In terms of the trigger size and that kind of stuff, it's about the same. Looking at the thickness at the thinnest point, also about the same. And here with them stacked, you can get a better idea of how much smaller the Retroid Pocket 5 is, and they both do have the exact same screen area. Now, those physical differences do make a fairly significant in comfort. The RG556 really is cradled into your hands. Now, it does have a bottom D-pad versus top D-pad, so it's a little less optimal for D-pad gaming, but definitely more comfortable for joystick gaming just because your hands are placed a little bit farther away. But the joysticks aren't the best, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And yeah, overall, it is a nice shape. But one other thing I want to mention is that this plastic is just, it feels like garbage, to be honest. It's so shiny, so slick. It gets greasy really easily, and it just does not feel good at all. I've never owned the black version, so I'm not sure if that's any better, but just know that it is not the nicest texture altogether. The Retroid Pocket 5, on the other hand, has an all-glass front, and it does have a much nicer plastic texture on the back. There's a little bit of this knurling on the grips that make it feel more comfortable, and maybe a little bit more smudge resistant than the RG556, though the glass front can still pick up some fingerprints here and there for sure. Now, related to comfort, as far as the quality of all those buttons, let's just take a quick recap. Check out my Retroid Pocket 5 initial impressions and setup guide on this channel, or check out my in-depth review on the Retro Handhelds channel if you want an in-depth dive on all these buttons. And there's plenty of reviews of the RG556 out there, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that today, but I'm just going to give my quick impressions here. Shoulder buttons, serviceable on both, but much louder on the RG556 to the point where they're almost annoying. The triggers feel a bit better quality on the Retroid Pocket 5. Both are completely serviceable, though they have a little bit better texture on the 5 over here. As far as the face buttons go, I would say that I like the Anbernics a little better overall in terms of feel. I don't love the glossy finish, and they do have a little bit more wiggle in them when you move them back and forth, which isn't the most premium, but I like the feeling of the membrane a little bit better on the Anbernic, but neither one of them are deal breakers, and they're pretty similar in size. As far as the D-pads go, the Retroid Pocket 5 I think is a clear winner here. It does have that dome switch type of actuation, which is a bit more clicky, but it is very tactile and you can tell what you're doing. The 556 is kind of grossly shiny, and it's not a terrible D-pad, though it is pretty easy to get a diagonal there if you're not careful. It's a nice size, but I really just wish the texture was a little bit better on that. Start and select buttons are a better location on the Retroid up top. They're down at the bottom right here on the Anbernic. And then we've got the home and back here versus the home and back over here. And here's where a big difference in the controls come out. On the Retroid Pocket 5, we can smoothly go anywhere in this range we want with no issues whatsoever. But on the 556, it likes to snap to those cardinal directions, so you get a lot of that cross, and it's much harder to get precise diagonals in between. You can kind of see how it clicks to those, whereas the 5 does not, and that's the same on both joysticks here. And overall, the Retroid joysticks are a little bit taller and have a little bit more travel and are a little bit smoother with better resistance. So the joysticks are definitely way better on the Retroid Pocket 5 than the Anbernic, so keep that in mind. However, because of the device's size, you kind of have to hold a claw grip to use dual joystick games. You can't really grip it tightly, whereas on the 556, you can grip it tightly when using the joysticks. So it is more comfortable, but the joysticks are worse. So I kind of wish we had the best of both worlds here, the two kind of combined, but maybe somebody will make a nice grip for the 5 to help resolve that. Next up, let's take a quick look at the screens on these two side by side. I do think that the Retroid Pocket 5 has a little bit better color, but they both do look pretty good being OLED. I'm going to freeze frame here because one thing you'll notice is that there is this banding or shimmering effect on the 556 that is not shown on camera in the Retroid Pocket 5. In the room, they both look the same, but I believe what this means is that the PWM or pulse wave modulation that modulates the brightness for the display is at perhaps a lower frequency than the Retroid Pocket 5, and for some people that can actually cause eye fatigue. So if you know that you're susceptible to some OLED screens giving you eye fatigue, the 556 might be a worse offender. I don't experience this issue, so in person these both look about the same to me, but just one thing to note that is why you are seeing this on camera here. One other thing that some people have noticed more on the 556 than other displays is that the gray can display this Mura effect, or kind of almost this vertical streaking. This particular 556 isn't too bad of a sample, and we can kind of see a little bit of modeling in the display on the Retroid Pocket 5, but it's not a huge difference between either one. The Retroid Pocket 5 looking just a bit smoother. So I think on all fronts, the Retroid Pocket 5 screen is just a little bit better. Let's take a look at brightness and dimness and see how they stack up. So pulling them both all the way down, you can see that they are a very similar level, but that pulse wave effect looks really gross on the 556 here as it's picked up by the camera. Again, I can't see that in person, but you may or may not be susceptible to that depending on your vision. And here at max brightness, let me adjust my camera exposure. So you can see here, while not night and day, that at the maximum brightness, the RP5 is a little bit brighter than the RG556. Let's take a quick look at sound. One big difference is there's front firing speakers on the Retroid Pocket 5 and they are down firing in the 556. I would say that overall the audio is clearer and crisper from the Retroid Pocket 5. The 556 might have a little bit more warmth and low end to it, but at sacrifice of clarity, maybe partially because of the down firing. I think I would still take the Retroid Pocket 5 speakers over the 556 due to the fact that they are more clear, but if you want a little bit more bass heavy, then maybe the 556 isn't too terrible. Now I'm going to start off at PSP here, which I think will be run just fine by both, but I didn't want to waste any time testing lower end systems that are all going to run just fine on both handhelds, and since they're the exact same size screen, we don't really need to do an aspect ratio comparison between the two on different systems. One other note, for all tests in this video, we're going to be using Vulkan drivers on both devices, since OpenGL performs significantly worse on the 556, and Vulkan still gives an edge on the RP5 as well. As far as performance modes, I'm running the Retroid Pocket 5 in the medium performance mode for the tests here because the high performance doesn't make a huge difference. And then on the 556, I am running it in the high performance mode instead of the auto mode. So first up here, we are looking at 4x PSP, that's 1080p, so native resolution on both displays. And as you can see, we're getting a little bit of slowdowns, about to 95% on here. The Retroid Pocket 5, however, can play at 7x scaling at 100% speed. Now, do you really need 7x scaling for PSP? No, they both run 4x mostly, though we would need 3x on the 556 to get a totally smooth 100%. Let's take another quick look at a different PSP game. We're going to go back to 4x on both. Split Second here is a 30 frames per second game, so 30 is the cap. And you can see here that they are both handling it fine at 4x resolution. Just to show the performance differential, I'm going to bump them both up to 8x or 4K, and they're both actually running 100% here, so I don't think you need to play more than 4K on PSP, that's for sure. Oh, we do see a slowdown here in that crash sequence though, so 4K is a little bit too much for the RG556, but you know, whatever. So to sum up PSP, Yes, they can both run mostly 4x. You will see some slowdowns on certain more demanding games like God of War on the 556 that may need you to drop down to 3x or 720p, but the RP5 will handle every single game at 4x without issue, so it's nice to just lock and load on that. But PSP is probably not the reason that I would buy the Retroid Pocket 5 over the 556, because the 556 is already a pretty good PSP machine, so let's move on to something a little bit more demanding. Next up, we're going to use Lime 3DS to check out some 3DS games. To speed up the testing, I'm not going to go through every single resolution on the rest of the tests. I've already pre-tested to see what the limits are, so I'm just going to go ahead and push them both up to their maximum so you can get a quick idea of what the difference looks like between the two. First up, let's check out Kirby Planet Robobot on 3DS. For this game, I've discovered that the RP5 can run it at 6x native or 2400 by 1440, and the RG556 can run it at 3x native or 1200 by 720. Giving this just a moment here to build up the shader caches, but as you can see, we are both running at 60 frames per second. Again, we're at 3x on the 556 and 6x on the Retroid Pocket 5. If we try to bump up the RG556, we will quickly see that here at 4x native, I'm now seeing some drops to 83% speed, about 50 frames per second on the RG556. Like with PSP, we do have to ask ourselves, do we need more than 1600 by 960? If you're in a screen layout where the main screen is side by side with the other one, then that is already enough resolution. And if you're full screening the game, then yeah, that's not quite 1080 pixels, but it's close enough that for 3DS, I wouldn't necessarily buy one over the other based on performance alone. Let's check out one more 3DS game before we move on. Here on A Link Between Worlds, I was only able to achieve 2x on the 556 while still maintaining 6x on the Retroid Pocket 5. You may see a few stutters initially, but that is just the shaders caching. As soon as these are all generated, we will see that they are both running at 60 frames per second at 2x and 6x respectively. If we take the 556 and we try to bump it up, now on 3x down here, our frames per second have dropped to about 87% and 52 frames per second. So in this game at 2x, the game still looks pretty good, but the Retroid Pocket 5 does look a lot crisper. So for some more demanding 3DS titles, maybe you could make an argument for the Retroid Pocket 5 over the 556 if all other things were equal, but they're not, so let's keep continuing and check out even more challenging systems. As we move up the difficulty scale, the next one we're going to check out is GameCube. First up, we're going to look at Burnout 2. So here we're at 2x on the 556 and 4x on the Retroid Pocket 5. The next test, we're at 4x on the 556 and 6x on the Retroid Pocket 5, both not quite hitting the mark here. So our limits on the two are 2x 720p on the 556 and 4x for 2560 by 2112 on the Retroid Pocket 5, which exceeds the display resolution, as 3x would be just fine. So in this situation, I would say that we start to see the Retroid Pocket 5 take a little bit more of a lead where it matters, being able to do 1080p versus 720p. Although 720p still looks pretty good on this screen, I personally do like getting the advantage of all the pixels. Let's take a look at one of my all-time favorites, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. For Tony Hawk, we can run at 5x on the RP5 and almost 3x on the 556, and we'll show that off. You can see here we have a little bit in the high 90s, whereas here we are clearing 100 without issue. Dipped down to just under 100. I would say that you could play this on the 556 and just have a couple small dips here and there and it wouldn't be a big deal. But sometimes if you bail or something like that, it can slow down, but it looks like we were okay there. I did just notice I have this stretched on this one, so sorry about that, but they are pushing the same amount of pixels. So again, almost 3x or 1080p on the 556 and 5x clearing 1080p on the RP5. For one last GameCube game, let's take a look at one of the classic tests of all time, and we'll pull up F-Zero GX. As a reminder, make sure you turn dual core on for F-Zero GX as it defaults to off, and that does cause a lot of slowdowns. Even though it does increase the instability, I found it still mostly playable with that on. And this is where you start to see some real differences. The 556 can just barely pull off native resolution on this game. As you can see here, we're only doing 80% at 1x, and we are clearing 100% here on the Retroid Pocket 5 at 5x. I did want to progress a little bit farther on F-Zero to see what other maps were like, so I went to, I believe, the third map here, and here's where we start to see some real issues with performance. Again, 5x and 1x. We can already see 5x is too much for the Retroid Pocket 5, but that's not a big deal, we'll adjust that. They're both running right now at about the same 80% at 5x versus 1x. We're not getting the full speed here. Let's lower the Retroid Pocket 5 down to 3x, which still gives us 1080p, and we'll leave the 556 here at 1x since we can't go any lower. 3x, 1x. Almost hitting 100%, although we are still slowing down at the start here, but I think it'll get better once we start the race. Yeah, here we're getting almost 100%, and here we're just over 100% once the race starts. 95 on both. It's definitely a map that the consoles struggle with a little bit. So let's drop down the 5 to 2x for 720p. 556 a little faster at the start, but that's just because it's only running at 1x. Once we're in map, the RP5 is running a little bit better at 2x than the 556 is at 1x. So this might be one of the more demanding situations on the GameCube. And in this situation, it's nice to have that horsepower of the RP5 because we can either run smoothly at 1x or almost smoothly at 2x, whereas here we're struggling just to run smoothly at 1x or native resolution. You also see some graphics glitches. I don't know if that's just on the 556 drivers. It doesn't appear to be happening over here. So for GameCube, as you saw with a game like Tony Hawk, the 5x versus 3x isn't that big of a deal, and the 556 still plays it mostly fine. And then we moved into Burnout 2, and 2x was okay, but not 3x, so 720p. And then finally in F-Zero GX, we struggled to get 1x on the 556, so the GameCube catalog is going to vary quite a bit depending on which game. Let's step up one more performance tier and check out PS2. Let's take a look at another Burnout game. I can already tell you it's not going to run well on the 556, so we're going to drop straight down to 1x native, and on the RP5, we are going to do 3x native. Here you can see we're only running at 65% even at 1x. This game is pretty much unplayable on the 556, but we are running just fine at 100% at 3x resolution on the RP5, so here we do have a clear winner. We can even knock down the 556 even further and see if it makes a difference, but I really don't think that it does. And it's going to look like a blurry mess, but just to check it out, let's go down to 1/2 native resolution. Now, we're still not even hitting 100%, so I don't even think there's much performance game going below 1x. So here is a game that you probably wouldn't want to play on the 556 at all. Here we have God of War 2 running at 2.5x on the RP5 and 1x on the RG556. Do see occasional dips below on both of these at the respective settings. You can drop down to 2 for completely seamless on the RP5, but you're still not going to get completely seamless at 1x on the RG556. So God of War 2 is another game where the Retroid Pocket 5 does give you a nice advantage. Let's test one more game. Let's check out Gran Turismo 3. For Gran Turismo 3, we have the Retroid Pocket 5 running at 3x with no issues, and the 556 mostly running at 2x with some minor slowdowns. You could drop that down to 1.5x to be sure that you'll hit 100%, but I personally appreciate that little bit of extra visual fidelity. So to sum up PlayStation 2, some of the biggest differences so far: some games are going to run fine at a reasonable resolution on both devices, even though the RP5 does edge out a bit more, but there are some games that are going to be completely unplayable even at 1x on the 556, and almost all those games are playable at 2x at least on the RP5, so you're going to get nice crisp resolution here, and on here you're going to get a blurry, less than 60 frames per second mess. So if you want to play PS2, then the RP5 is really starting to come out ahead here. And finally, we're going to take a look at Nintendo Switch. Now, Nintendo Switch on Android isn't really an optimal experience regardless, as you're always fiddling a bit with drivers, resolution, and performance modes to get the best out of any Android handheld, even the more powerful ones. But I still wanted to at least show it just so you can see that maybe there's some games that you could run on the RP5 and they might not be an option at all on the RG556. So first up, I've got SteamWorld Dig here. I'm running docked 1080p on the RP5 and I'm running 720p handheld mode on the RG556. And both of these perform perfectly acceptable at these modes. In docked mode, the RG556 could not hold 60 frames per second. I got about 45 frames per second. But for a 2D game, platformer game like this, then the RG556 and the RP5 can both play the games acceptably. As far as the games we're testing today, that's pretty much where it ends for the RG556. Nothing else that I tested, in my experience, quite reached 60 frames per second on the 556. Prince of Persia is a relatively easy to run side-scrolling 3D game on the Switch, so let's take a look at that. We can afford to run it in docked 1080p on the 5, but on the RG556 we have to drop all the way down to half resolution, which doesn't exactly lead to the most fun experience. So as you can see here, we're getting about 60 FPS on both, but we are even dropping a little bit underneath 60 on the 556, even though it's running at only half resolution. So I mean, we're talking 360p versus 1080p. So this looks blurry, but it's sort of playable, and this looks sharp and crisp and is 100% playable for Prince of Persia. So let's jump over to another game. So here again at docked resolution, we are getting 30 frames per second, which is the native frame rate of this game on the Nintendo Switch. 1080p looks beautiful, vibrant, and crisp. And then down here on the 556, we are getting a whopping 14 or 15 frames per second at 360p half resolution handheld. So the game is a completely unplayable slow motion mess. Finally, I wanted to take a look at Hades here. Again, I'm going to run it at half resolution handheld here, and it's not going to be playable, but on the Retroid Pocket 5, it will run, but not at full docked resolution. I do need to knock it down to 0.75x when in docked mode, or about 810p. And then a quick note on drivers here. The default 746 Qualcomm driver has graphical glitches and issues in Hades on the Retroid Pocket 5, but you can download the 777 driver from the Kimchi Turnip GitHub, and that will work, as well as you can use the 23.2 Turnip driver, and that will work okay. The newest 25 revision 2 Turnip driver crashes and is not stable on the Retroid Pocket 5. So here on the Retroid Pocket 5, you can see that we are getting 60 frames per second. And at 810p, it's okay. But also this game isn't running at a full 1080p in docked mode already. I think it's already rendering at like 720p even in docked and then upscaling. So it's outputting 810p, but it's probably actually only like 540p under the hood. So it's not the cleanest visual experience I've ever seen on a game here. And of course down here, we are at a half X 360p handheld resolution and barely struggling to get a choppy 20 to 25 or so frames per second, so I would not consider it playable on the 556. So to wrap up Switch emulation, the first thing I would say is buy a Switch and play Switch games on that. The second thing I would say is the Retroid Pocket 5 is capable of handling some 3D games at 60 frames per second and some 3D games at 60 frames per second with a reduced multiplier, and it is pretty much capable of playing most 2D games on Switch as long as they don't have graphical incompatibilities. The 556, you're limited pretty much to 2D games in handheld 720p mode, and 3D games are mostly going to be a no-go. It just does not have the horsepower to drive them, or at least the emulator is not optimized enough to use what is available. So now I'd like to just do a rapid fire recap of everything we've talked about so far and run that down really quickly. Physically, the 556 is better, but a bit more comfortable with the nice handles, but a crappier feeling plastic on it. The Retroid Pocket 5 is more compact, but a little bit less ergonomic when using the joysticks for control. The displays are roughly equal. There may be some issues for those sensitive to pulse wave modulation displays on the 556, and the RP5 is a little bit more vibrant and a little bit brighter than the 556 display, though both look excellent and are the same resolution and size. Sound-wise, they're both decent. The Retroid Pocket 5 is a little bit clearer, and the 556 might have a little bit more bass, but at a compromise of clarity. For emulation performance, they're both going to be great options for PSP. You should have no issues running your PSP catalog at 1080p on these devices, maybe occasionally having to drop to 720p on the 556. For 3DS, both are pretty good options. You may have to reduce to 2x resolution on the 556 and sacrifice a little bit of visual clarity, but it's still going to look pretty good. But the Retroid Pocket 5 is capable of outputting at least 1080p on 3DS games, so that is nice to see. For GameCube, it starts getting a little bit different. There are some games that the 556 is going to play at 3x and is going to look nice and crisp on the display, but there are also some games that are going to struggle to play just at 1x, whereas on the Retroid Pocket 5, you're pretty much always going to be able to do 3x or more resolution to get a nice crisp 1080p plus picture on the Retroid Pocket 5. So if you're going for GameCube, I do kind of lean towards recommending the Retroid Pocket 5 here. Now, if you're really on a budget, maybe you might want to get the 556, or if you can pick it up secondhand, that could make more sense, but GameCube is okay on the 556. Moving on to PS2, I think that's where the 556 really starts to fall behind. There are games that won't even run at 1x at all on here. They'll run at like 60% frames per second, and dropping them down below 1x resolution does not help. They are just kind of a blurry, laggy mess. But on the Retroid Pocket 5, we're always going to be able to play at least a 2x upscale, and in some cases 3 to 4x on games that are a little less hard to run, so everything's going to look nice and crisp on the Retroid Pocket 5. Another hidden benefit is if you get the black unit and there's this bezel-less display, if you're playing 4:3 games, you don't really notice it, whereas it's a little bit more noticeable where you got this border and blue device here. But either way, the games look good on both devices in terms of the screen clarity. Finally, for Nintendo Switch, you're going to be able to play some 3D games, sometimes downscaled on the Retroid Pocket 5, and you're going to be able to play most 2D games, again, as long as they're compatible and don't have emulator or driver issues. On the 556, you're only going to be able to play 2D games at maybe a 720p resolution, and most 3D games are going to struggle to run at anything resembling a normal frame rate, even at a blurry 360p resolution. That all said, who should buy which of these? Well, if the price difference is somewhere between $30 and $50 depending on sales, and $30 and $50 is not breaking the bank for you, unless you really want these extra bump outs, there's really not a situation I would recommend the 556 over the RP5. The RP5 just delivers an experience where everything just pretty much works out of the box, other than maybe Switch. But for PS2 and GameCube, it's going to play all the games with minimal tinkering, whereas the 556 is going to require a lot more messing with the settings to get something that is playable, especially in PS2 and on more demanding GameCube games. If you're picking up the 556 secondhand, maybe you're getting it for $140, and this is $220, so now it's an $80 difference. Well, I mean, if you're only going to pay PSP and below, then totally this is not a bad option at all, even though I think the RP5 D-pad is a little bit better for those 2D games, but you know, it's certainly a contender. If you already have the 556 and you're thinking about upgrading to the Retroid Pocket 5, it gets a little more complicated. Maybe you can sell your RG556 for $140 used, and then you're spending another $90 plus shipping, so over $100 to upgrade to the Retroid Pocket 5. Well, if there's PS2 games that you want to play that the 556 doesn't run, or you want to play some of those harder to run GameCube games, or you want to dabble at all into Switch emulation, then sure, that $100 might be worth it if you can afford it. But if you're mostly going to play PSP, 3DS, DS, and two-dimensional systems below that, then no, I wouldn't upgrade from the 556 because it still offers a great screen and gameplay experience. What do you think? Do you guys agree? Do you think the Retroid Pocket 5 is pretty much a must-buy over the 556 in almost all scenarios? Or do you think it's worth it to get the 556 either for the ergonomic or price differences? Let me know down in the comments. As always, thanks for watching and happy gaming.